Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. This is our last session in the ASCE conference, and it is the student session. This is a very important session, I think, we all think, which was started some years ago by Enrique Pumar. Pumar has a lot of vision. He is now professor of sociology and chair of the Department of Sociology at Santa Clara University in California, and he was formerly at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. Pumar is with us today, which is very nice. Today's chair for this conference, and the one that has done all the work on this year's papers, which was a lot of work because we fortunately had a lot of students who submitted papers, which was very, very nice. And that is Mario González-Corzo. Mario is, of course, here with us. So I will introduce Mario to you, and then Mario will introduce the students. I do want you to notice that in the questions and answers, where you can always send us questions and answers, if you go into more, Q&A, and that there we have put the information on where you can get all the papers and the PowerPoints that we have so far that have been presented at this conference, okay? And this is the website of the Coalition for Peace and Ethics. That is Larry Katabaker's website, and that's where he has put all the participant shared papers and PowerPoints for the ASCE conference. So those are available to everybody. Okay, so let me introduce Mario. Mario is associate professor in the Department of Economics and Business at Lehman College of the City University of New York, better known as CUNY. There he teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in economics and finance. Mario González-Corzo is also a faculty fellow of the Cuba project of the Bildner Center. This was a Cuba project that was started by Mauricio Font, who has also participated with us in ASCE for many years. And it's part of the Bildner Center for Western Hemisphere Studies in the Graduate Center of CUNY. Mario was a contributing editor for the section on the Cuban economy of the Handbook of Latin American Studies, published by the Library of Congress. His research and publications focus on economic reforms in transition economies, with a particular emphasis on Cuban agriculture, banking, and the emerging non-state sector. He also monitors financial sector employment trends and entrepreneurship, with a focus on transition and post-socialist economies. Mario.
Thank you, Sylvia, very much. And I'd like to welcome everyone to our wonderful student panel. I have prepared a very brief PowerPoint that I want to share with you as I introduce the panel and as we navigate through this. So the ASCE student panel, what I really want to do is just take a couple of minutes and provide some background and history about the panel. I've been doing some homework in preparation for this session. And so the ASCE student competition, as everybody here knows, is formerly known as the Jorge Perez Lopez Student Prize. I know that in my literature, in my emails, for the sake of brevity, I refer to it often as the ASCE student competition or the ASCE student prize, but I want to recognize the fact that it's officially known as the Jorge Perez Lopez Student Prize. And that is really in honor of Jorge Perez Lopez, who is one of the most respected and admired members of the association. He's played a pivotal role, as everybody here knows, and I'm very happy to recognize the fact that we are, every year we have the student competition, really Jorge plays a critical role, and it is an honor to share this competition that carries his name. I also want to mention something that Sylvia already mentioned, which is that for more than 20 years, under the chairmanship of Professor Enrique Pumar, who is here with us, who was agreeable to serve as a discussant and who served for so many years as the chair of this panel, you know, the ASCE Student Prize competition has really emerged as a venue for young scholars like the ones that we'll be presenting here today to present their Cuba-related research. I looked back at some data and I found that more than 50+ papers have been presented in this panel since the early 2000s. I have to confess, I should have gone back to 1990 to the founding of ASCE, because by the way, this is the 30th year that since the founding of ASCE. And so, but since the early 2000s, 50 plus papers have been presented in the student panel. And in fact, we have not just anecdotal evidence, but actual evidence showing that participating in the student prize competition, either directly or indirectly, has opened many doors for young promising scholars that have gone through the competition, and they've been able to build networks and relationships and go on to really important positions in academia, in think tanks, and in other kinds of institutions. I'm also proud to say that many of the recipients remain active members of ASCE. So I'm hoping that the students that are participating today, and I'm going to use I'm also going to tell them that I'm going to be hounding them to join ASCE. I'm really hopeful that many of these, that all of them who are participating today, and in fact, many from the past will become and will remain active members of ASCE. Since 2018, I've been serving as the chair of the panel. And it's really, my hope is that the panel will continue to grow in the coming years, but there's one missing bullet point here in the slide that you're seeing, and that is, I really want to thank the reviewers, the blind reviewers that participated this year for their work, for their contribution, for their valuable comments. I do have some comments from some of our reviewers that I will share with the students, but I wanted to do that after the panel. These are really useful comments, and the reviewers did an excellent job in turning in their reviews and turning in their scores and so on. And finally, before presenting the panel and opening up the obviously the panel for the presenters that we have here today, I wanted to share with you some very short statistics about this year's panel. So as you can see here, we received a total of 9 papers in the panel. 8 were graduate papers, 1 was an undergraduate paper, but I also wanted to show you by geographic region. We got 2 papers from Cuba, 4 were from the USA, 3 came from Europe. This is in the middle of a pandemic, of course. This is in the middle of an environment that we're facing a lot of uncertainty in academia. And even under those circumstances, we received all these papers that you're seeing here, which I'm very proud to say that this is a significant number of papers. Remember, keep in mind that the topic of Cuba has, it's a limited topic in many ways. Keep in mind that, that again, we're going through a very uncertain environment, and but I'm very happy with the results that I'm showing you here. In terms of topics, we received papers about entrepreneurship, foreign investment, trade, international relations, politics, society, even one about history. And I wanted to close by saying that if you look at the kinds of papers that we have received over the years for the student competition, not only has the quality continue to improve, but I'm very pleased to see that students who study different fields beyond economics find ASCE as an attractive venue to submit their work. And so the student prize competition, it's really one of the, as Sylvia mentioned before, one of the most important panels for ASCE, but not just the panel, it's also an opportunity for us to welcome young, promising scholars. And so today what we have in our panel will be structured as follows. The first paper will be by Adriana Vitagliano from Oxford Universities. She will present a paper on remittances and protest, the case of Cuba. That presentation, Adriana's presentation, will be followed by Denisse Delgado from the University of Massachusetts. Denisse's paper is about the role of the Cuban diaspora in the economic and political changes in the island. And then the third paper will be a paper by Isabelle, and I think I probably misspelled your name, Isabelle. I hope not, but anyway, Isabelle DeSisto. She is from Harvard University. And her topic is, the title of her paper is Atoms for Autonomy. And the objective is to explain the Cuban reaction to the Chernobyl nuclear accident. We will have after the paper, so each presenter will have 15, that is 15 minutes to present their papers. And then following the presentations, we're going to have two discussants who were kind enough to agree to join us here today. The first discussant will be Professor Enrique Pumar from Santa Clara University. So Professor Pumar will comment on the papers from Denisse and Isabelle. And then the second discussant is Michael Strauss, who was also very kind to agree to share his comments, and he will comment on Adriana's paper. And so without further ado, I would like to ask our first presenter, Adriana, to please go ahead and present your paper. And 15 minutes, or if you can do better than that, that'll be great. So welcome, Adriana, and we look forward to seeing your presentation.
Thank you so much. And I will just start presenting. Okay. Oh. So thank you, Mario. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the team for the opportunity to present alongside such wonderful panelists. This presentation is based on research conducted in support of my master's dissertation at Oxford, where I recently graduated with an MSc in Latin American Studies. And so I'll just start with a brief outline. Essentially, in this paper, I build on existing studies as well as remittance micro-theories to further explore how remittances might impact protest in non-democracies. And how this may have trickle-down effects on the longevity of incumbent authoritarian regimes. So to begin just with a brief overview of general remittance trends, remittances serve a wide range of uses, the main and most popular being immediate consumption, so the purchase of basic welfare goods, but they can also be used as capital for financing small enterprises and small businesses. Remittances represent an increasingly crucial source of external financing for low and middle income countries. And this is represented by a variety of different attributes, a few of which I'll touch on here. So in terms of sheer volume, last year in 2019, remittances reached a record 554 billion to LMICs. And this far outpaces both FDI and portfolio investment. So again, clearly a very important source of capital. In terms of reliance, if we look at percentage of GDP, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, remittances can form up to 10% of GDP for certain nations, and in Central America, in certain cases, up to the 30%. And on top of all of this, we're seeing consistent impressive growth trends in remittances. So again, within the region itself, remittances have consistently increased by between 6 to 9.5% over the past 5 years. And in between 2005 and 2015, globally, remittances more than doubled. So again, as the importance increases, it's very interesting to look at the forecast and see that as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, remittances are, for the first time in recent history, projected to decrease this year. And they're estimated to suffer a decline of almost up to 20% globally. And that's a similar number for Latin America and the Caribbean. So given all this and given the increasing importance, it's unsurprising that remittances have a wide variety of economic effects as well as political and social effects. However, the majority of remittance literature is mainly focused on economic effects, both micro and macro, with the study of political effects really a relatively new focus of scholars. And so within this growing body, there are contradictory findings related to the relationship between remittances and democratization, as well as remittances and their impact on either reinforcing or eroding the stability of authoritarian regimes. And so this is where I situate my study, is specifically looking at the impact of remittances on protest. And within literature, there are two existing conflicting micro-theories. The first being that remittances decrease protests through the substitution effect, which essentially refers to the dynamic whereby remittances increase the income of recipients, These funds are then used to purchase welfare goods, thereby relieving the government of the need to provide these welfare goods. As a result, these funds can then be diverted and channeled to support the strength of the regime. Another point here is that remittances have been found to also have a mitigating effect on dissatisfaction of citizens with their governments. However, on the other hand, we have studies that have found that remittances can actually increase the rates of protest through the patronage effect, whereby remittances, by increasing income of recipients, reduce their reliance on the state. So reduce their reliance on clientelistic networks, and as a result, actually increase resources needed to protest and decrease the risk or the cost associated with protest for these citizens. So this is essentially to say that we still don't have a clear view of what the relationship is. And one study by a scholar essentially identifies the social remittance effect, so a third causal mechanism, as a means of explaining these conflicting results. And the social remittance effect, originally identified by Peggy Levitt in the 90s, basically says as money is sent back, migrants who have absorbed, perhaps norms, ideas, and principles in their host countries also send these ideas back with the money. And as a result, if we look at the source of remittances, in cases where remittances are sent from non-democracies to non-democracies, we're much less likely to see any positive correlation between remittances and protest. But this would not be the case when remittances are sent from democracies to autocracies. And so this is where I situate my question, which is how might this apply to the case of Cuba, specifically with remittances sent from the US? And to conduct this discussion, I leverage Albert Hirschman's Exit, Voice, and Loyalty framework, which has been used to analyze interactions between citizens and their government using political variants of the initial schema used to look at failing firms and customers. And so his initial conceptualization of exit and voice categorizes them as rival actions, that as citizens pursue exit, this is at the cost of the atrophy of voice and vice versa. However, these can also serve as complementary actions. And so this poses a question, when citizens are dissatisfied with their government, when might exit prevail over voice? And then when might both actions be pursued simultaneously or jointly? And how might this linkage occur? So that brings me to my hypothesis, which was that I expected to find as US remittances to Cuba increase, that protest might as well. And then using Hirschman's framework, I suggested that US remittances to Cuba might serve as a linking mechanism for bringing exit and voice together to work in tandem. So in order to test this, I applied a mixed methods approach. I conducted a simple statistical analysis and then conducted a qualitative analysis using Hirschman's framework once again. So first, I estimated total US remittances to Cuba over the past 30 years. And I then plotted this in comparison to values extrapolated from UN data on total remittances to Cuba. This figure here shows both of these data points plotted against each other. You can see the curve is quite similar, with the blue estimate showing more aggressive growth. So having estimated my remittance variable, I then developed a variable for measuring protest, which can of course be done in a variety of ways. I ended up referencing several different databases and developing variables based on observed indicators of protest. So observed demonstrations, anti-regime demonstrations in newspapers and different media sources. I developed two different variables, one based on the maximum reported cases and one based on the average. And again, you can see here they follow a very similar curve in terms of the trends of frequency over time. And again, this is for the past 30 years. And then I tested these variables using a simple non-parametric correlation analysis. The figures here show that the results of this test, which was a significant relationship and a moderate to strong positive correlation between remittances and protest. And looking at both variables, that was the case. So these findings would suggest support for both Maydam's and Escriba-Folch's initial theory that remittances and protests might be positively correlated in non-democracies. However, in order to look and explore the causality of this relationship a bit more, I return to leveraging Hirschman's framework. And what I propose is that while exit may have in the beginning initially undermined voice in Cuba by eliminating the population of citizens that might be the most passionately dissenting or the most likely to organize politically and participate in protest, that these multiple waves of outmigration ultimately developed this, US-based diaspora and this community by providing remittances back to the island, ultimately actually facilitated the demonstration of this dissenting voice. And the way this occurred was through the means of increasing or contributing to the development of both opportunity and motivation for protest. And so in this sense, remittances mechanize this linkage of exit and voice. So we don't see a seesaw where exit occurs at the expense of voice, and rather we see that through remittances, these two actions can actually work in tandem. And then similarly, that because of the way that they contribute to increased opportunity and motivation for protest, we see the patronage and social remittance effects potentially also occurring here. So having said this, to conclude, this obviously is an area of study that could benefit from further focus, further research, especially in terms of design. I think that there are additional elements, perhaps ethnography or different estimates of remittances that could be incorporated to make this a bit more robust. But then I'd also like to point out that given the current climate with the COVID-19 pandemic, this research poses increasingly important topics for research as well. Countries that are dependent on remittances are likely to be disproportionately impacted by the economic decline. Migrants are often the first to be impacted by economic crises. And as we've seen, the industries in which they're often employed have been hit most severely in many cases: services, tourism, etc. And yet despite this, even as remittances drop so dramatically, their importance will likely relatively continue to increase, because we see that according to World Bank estimates, foreign direct investment as well as private portfolio investment are estimated to drop even more dramatically than remittances by over 35% and 80% respectively. So given all this, basically a question I pose as perhaps of interest would be how these fluctuations in remittance flows might impact the political landscape of migrants' origin countries, particularly as related to democratization in autocracies, specifically protest rates and frequency. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Adriana. I have to apologize for a moment because I failed to introduce Adriana. I had her biographical note, so I'm going to do it in a very unorthodox way. I'm going to introduce you now after your presentation, so you can say, well, the host really, but let me briefly talk about Adriana and make her formal introduction here, which I think was the right thing for me to do at the time, but I won't do it for the others this bad, so bear with me. So Adriana, thank you for your presentation. It's a pleasure to have you here. Adriana Vitagliano, she holds an MSc in Latin American Studies from Oxford University and a BA in International Affairs and Public Policy from Princeton University, around my neck of the woods. Her research interests include comparative political economy and entrepreneurship in Latin America. That's a big topic, entrepreneurship in Latin America, all over the place, right? Her previous works include her graduate dissertation, Remittances and Protests, a reconceptualization of exit and voice in the Cuban case. From all of Latin America, she chose our little island of Cuba, so great. And 2 undergraduate theses, Emerging Entrepreneurship and Foreign Investment in Cuba, and Competing Narratives of Gentrification in Old Havana. Adriana is currently pursuing an MBA from Oxford University, Said School of Business, as a Forte Foundation Fellow. So that was our first presenter. Now I'm going to present our second presenter, who is Denisse. Delgado Vasquez. The title of her presentation is The Cuban Diaspora's Participation in the Economic and Political Changes on the Island. So Denisse is a public policy PhD student at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she's studying the Cuban diaspora's economic and political participation in processes of change in Cuban society, with a particular focus on, guess what, remittances. Denisse is currently collaborating with the Latin American Migration Remittances, oops, I went too fast, and development program at the Inter-American Dialogue, and let's see, and as well as International Organization of Remittances and Migration. She has been a visiting scholar at various universities, including the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard, the Cuban Research Institute, our dear Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University, where she was a visiting fellow last summer. Before that, she was a researcher affiliated with the Havana think tank CIPS, and she's a principal collaborator for the Cuban Capacity Building Project, Cuban Horizon at Columbia Law School. Denisse earned a BA in sociology from the Universidad de La Habana and a master's MA in social development from the Universidad Católica de Murcia. So it is my pleasure to now turn it over to Denisse, who will be presenting her paper, The Cuban Diaspora's Participation in the Economic and Political Changes on the Island. Go ahead, Denisse, you have 15 minutes.
Yes, welcome. Thank you very much. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for this welcoming and the introductory remarks. And so I want to thank ASCE, Jorge Perez Lopez, Mario Corso, Silvia Pedraza, Larry Frank, the reviewers, everyone who has considered my paper for this important competition. And I also want to say that this research started last summer when I was a fellow at the Cuban Research Institute in Florida International University. So I want to also to thank Dr. Jorge Duani, all the, the research team, as well as especially to Dr. Guillermo Grenier, who granted me access to the data collected by the Cuba Pool 2018. So thank you very much. And this presentation is about the Cuban diaspora's participation in economic and political changes on the island, even though I focus more on the economic side. And also I want to be fast in the methodological and theoretical aspects, so I can go to the results, but from the methodological aspect, I followed a mixed method approach where I first analyzed the data collected by the Cuba Pool 2018, and then I combined the information I also collected from 10 in-depth interviews I conducted with Cuban Americans living in South Florida. So as all we know, political and economic reasons have motivated the Cuban migration abroad. And even though Cubans are spread out around the world, the US is the main country of reception. And there are different states where there is more representation of Cubans, but they are mainly based in Florida. So based on the US census from 2019, there were around 1 million of Cubans living specifically in Miami-Dade County in 2019. Parallel to migration, there have been some changes happening on the island. And in 2011, the Cuban government relaunched the private self-enterprise, private initiatives on the island. And before that time, there were less than 200,000 private entrepreneurs. But by September 2019, there were more than half a million of Cubans who were doing private enterprises on the island. At the same time, the amount of remittances have been growing over the years. And before 2011, so we can see there were like $1.9 billion arriving as remittances to the island. But by 2018, there were around 3.7 billion, which is 3.700 millones de dólares. on remittances. So these two factors, these two events are not disconnected. They are well designed and documented research based on case studies that shows that since the relaunch of the private enterprises in Cuba, there have been Cuban Americans that were motivated to participate in this process as well, and they start sending their working capital to support the development of private enterprises on the island. Oh, sorry. And there has been also some political changes happening between the two countries in the foreign relationships arena. And in 2016, former President Barack Obama traveled to Cuba, and he had a great impact, not only for the foreign policy relations, but also for the Cuban people mood. So I was fortunate enough to be there in that moment. I could feel the mood of the people, how happy they were. So it have like a double impact, I would say. And President Barack Obama traveled to Cuba with a group of influential actors, people, Cuban Americans who wanted to support the approach between the two countries. And since then, there were some changes happening in the Cuban economy as well. There was an increase in tourism. There were a lot of cruises arriving to the Havana Bay with a lot of Cuban Americans and the United States citizens. So to the fact that the US became the second largest visitor to the island, which was a great change for the Cuban economy, but also not only for the Cuban economy, but also for the people who were working upfront, offering their services to the tourists, especially because they receive tips, and tips means a lot for the Cuban economy, like for the family economy. And at the same time, there have been some changes on how the Cuban government has been approaching to the diaspora. So this is to the left, this is Rodrigo Manmierca, which is the Cuban Minister of Foreign Trade and Foreign Investment, who was inviting in 2019 the Cuban diaspora to participate in projects with Cuba, but it was mainly for to participate with the state and not with the private sector, which is something that I think is most needed to happen to formalize those channels. And it was also, the Cuban diaspora was also invited to participate with their opinions for a process of public consultation for the Cuban constitution. However, as I said, they were invited to share their voice, but not their vote. And for the economic participation, I'm going to take into account three variables. The first one is visits, the second one is sending remittances, and the third one is investments. And for the interviewers I was talking to, as soon as they got legal residence in the United States, they got their permanent residence, and they got some stable economic situation, they planned their first trip to Cuba to visit their families. And I found out there were some differences between generations. So the younger people, they plan their trips more frequently, sometimes every 3, 4, or 5 months, to see their friends and family on the island, while elder generations plans their trips less frequently, but for the people I was talking to, they spend more time in Cuba. So I have one of my cases of study. She lived between the two countries, and she spent half of the year in Havana and the other half of the year in the United States, which is a very interesting case for me, because every time she was referring home, I had to ask her what home means, because sometimes she was talking about her home in Florida, and other times she was talking about her home and family living in Cuba. According to the analysis of the data I made of the Cuba poll 2018, around 40% of the respondents said that they were sending remittances to their family or friends in Cuba. And from then, it is significant that 70% arrived to the US after 1995. And if you are familiar with the Cuba poll report, the one who was published, maybe you find some like slight differences compared to the numbers I'm presenting here. And I think that might be related to the sample weighting, but in general, the trends are the same. From the interviews I conducted, I could see that remittances play a key role for family consumption. So they have been used to solve basic needs, like things from the daily life, like food, clothing, transportation, support for health and education. One of my interviewees said in this respect that being able to send money to, he said, my family in those first months I got paid was an otherworldly thing, not to mention the first visit I made to Cuba, where I was able to pay a meal for my family and invite my friends out. Remittances have, well, these type of transactions have also worked as a working capital and have been used to the development of private enterprises. Sometimes it has been like more permanent and systematic way, other times it's something temporary. So one of my interviewees said that I am a computer engineer and sometimes I have clients I cannot attend. I ask a Cuban friend living on the island to make a web page or a web application for my client's business. They earn some extra money and I don't lose my client. This is a way I help my friends in Cuba. And in this case, this interviewee see that type of collaboration across borders as a win-win relationship. Regarding the Cuba pool, we can also see that almost half of the sample believe that US citizens should be allowed to invest in Cuban business if they want. They should have that right. And this is especially noticeable for the people who are younger, from 18 to 39 years old, and those who arrived after 1995. As well, 42% of these Cuban Americans who support investment on the island would invest in their own private company in Cuba. At the same time, Florida is home of influential actors and coalitions that impact on the US foreign policies towards Cuba. And my experience being in Florida, talking to the people, to very diverse people, has shown me a very diverse context, space, very vibrant in terms of politics, and people want to say what they think. And it has been really interesting to me to see that some actors have been trying to influence by helping connect people, by stimulating educational trips and cultural exchange. On the other hand, there are some other peoples who have been trying to limit that type of exchange. And that struggle has been kind of passionate for both sides. So, for example, Café Versailles is one of the historical places where part of the Cuban diaspora who live in South Florida goes there. They gather and protest, and they criticize the system operating in Cuba. And what I found really interesting during this last year studying the Cuban Americans living in South Florida is that I see there are new voices, new generations joining to those efforts, and they have become local activists. They are really mediatic, and I wonder to what extent they might be impacting or affecting, influencing the younger generation living in South Florida. So this is something that I'm really very looking forward to see the Cuba Pool 2020, to see what are the differences or how the Cuban American population in South Florida have been changing their political preferences as due to the influence of both the new policies, the current administration foreign policies towards Cuba, but also the emergence of new local activists. And finally, beyond all these, it seems kind of general that over 80% of Cubans living in Miami-Dade County believe that embargo has not worked. And this is something even across years of arrival, migratory wave, and age. So Finally, I have some policy recommendations because I believe this research have policy implications both for Cuban policymakers and for American policymakers. So my first recommendation is to formalize the diaspora's participation in the process of economic changes by establishing formal channels for them to invest their capital in the private sector in Cuba. For American policymakers to remove restrictions that prohibit or limit US citizens to invest, to have the right to invest in Cuban businesses and remittances travel. For both Cuban and American policymakers, I consider it's important to take new steps towards the normalization of diplomatic relations between the two countries that facilitates the Cuban diaspora participation in this process of both economic and political changes on the island, as well as for the Cuban policymakers integrate the Cuban diaspora into political process on the island, as well as it happens with other migrants in other countries in Latin America. And for Cuban policymakers to develop and implement programs for collective remittances that support communities with economic vulnerability and civil society well-being. And finally, the last recommendation is something that I didn't touch on my presentation for the time, we can talk about that later, is to expand the development of digital remittances technology as a way to reduce the cost of sending money to the island. So those are my main ideas for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Denisse. Thank you for your presentation. If you can unshare your screen so I can share mine. Okay, here we are. So I'm going to move on and introduce our third presenter. She is Isabelle DeSisto. The title of her presentation is Atoms for Autonomy, Explaining the Cuban Reaction to the Chernobyl Nuclear Accident. Isabelle graduated from Harvard University this May with a BA in Government and an MA in Regional Studies, concentrating on Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. Her primary research focuses on Soviet-Cuba relations. In 2018, Isabelle spent a semester studying in Havana. She returned to Havana, I suppose, in 2019 to conduct interview research for her master's thesis on Soviet-Cuban student exchange programs. And this fall, 2020, she will begin her master's in philosophy degree in politics, in the program in politics and international studies at the University of Cambridge. So welcome, Isabelle, to make your presentation. We're glad you were able to join us, and you have 15 minutes to present.
Sorry, I think you need to enable screen sharing. I'm not able to share my screen.
Why don't you try now?
Let's see. Now it's working. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes. My name is Isabelle, and you see my contact information here. I won't repeat the title of my presentation. You can read it here. Essentially, this research grew out of a simple term paper that I wrote for a class I took last year in the fall on Ukrainian history. And I'm hoping to expand this research in the future, so I look forward to getting your comments. Now, you may be wondering, what could Ukrainian history possibly have to do with Cuba? But I actually found this to be a very fruitful area of investigation, and my presentation explores the interesting connection between the Chernobyl nuclear disaster and nuclear power and Cuba. Okay, so to begin, on August 25th, 1986, there was an exchange of letters between Cuban President Fidel Castro and American Congressman Michael Bilirakis, which dominated the front page of Cuba's most popular daily newspaper, Granma. Bilirakis wrote his letter just 6 days after the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine. He wrote that he had learned of Cuba's plans to build its own nuclear power plant with Soviet aid. And in light of the Chernobyl accident, he urged Castro to, quote, learn from this tragic accident and take precautions against a repetition. Castro, of course, defended the Cuban project, asserting that, quote, no nuclear power plant in the United States has the security or the number of highly qualified engineers, technicians, and workers as ours. On the subject of Chernobyl, however, he remained silent. So now a contemporary reader, perhaps not the panelists and participants here who are perhaps more well acquainted with Cuban-Soviet relations, but someone perhaps who doesn't know might interpret Castro's silence to mean either he was unaware of the deadly consequences of Chernobyl or perhaps indifferent. Of course, neither is true. The Cuban government understood very well the damage that had been unleashed by Chernobyl, but refused to halt Cuban efforts to bring nuclear power to the island. In 1990, I argue that Cuba's seemingly contradictory behavior became even more pronounced when the government launched a program to bring children from the Chernobyl disaster zone to receive medical treatment in Cuba. By offering to treat tens of thousands of Chernobyl victims, Cuba was implicitly acknowledging the devastation caused by the accident. But at the same time as the Cuban government converted the beach of Tarara into a medical complex for Soviet patients, construction on nuclear reactors near the village of Juragua steamed ahead. So paradoxically, it seems that the Chernobyl accident really had a negligible impact on Cuba's plans to build its own nuclear power plant. And so considering this topic, I kind of came up with this research question, which is, why did the Cuban government launch a massive medical aid program for the victims of Chernobyl while simultaneously building a Cuban nuclear power plant? That seemed strange to me, and I wanted to investigate it further. So to set the scene, let's flash forward a little bit from April 1986, when Chernobyl accident happened, to June 2019, when I was in Moscow doing research in the Russian archives for my thesis on Soviet-Cuban exchange programs. And at that time, HBO's Chernobyl miniseries came out, which many of you may have seen. I highly recommend it if you have not. And this caused some controversy in Russia, as is to be expected. But what I didn't expect was that in early July, when I traveled from Moscow to Havana to interview Cubans who studied in Soviet universities, I did not expect that so many of my interviewees would bring up this Chernobyl series. They wanted to talk about it, and I was really curious as to what the connection between Cuba and Chernobyl could possibly be. And so I soon learned that Chernobyl has massive symbolic importance in Cuba because Cuba organized the largest program of medical aid to the Chernobyl victims of any country in the wake of the accident. Within Cuba, people are extremely proud of the Niños de Chernobyl program, but outside of the island, in the United States, and even in my Ukrainian history class, nobody had ever heard of this. Coincidentally, at the same time that I was in Havana, and there was a debut of a photo exhibit at the Fototeca, which I went to, and the exhibit was called Niños de Chernobyl, Documentos Extraviados, Children of Chernobyl, Lost Documents. And what was really interesting to me was that two Ukrainian men were in attendance at the opening, and they had received treatment as children. So although I was conducting research on a totally different topic at that time, I was really drawn in by this story. And so when it came time to write my term paper for my history class, I decided to make that the topic of my investigation. So to give you a brief overview of the Children of Chernobyl program, on April 26, 1986, during a routine maintenance test, a reactor exploded at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine, causing the worst nuclear accident in history. Initially, Cuban reaction to the Chernobyl accident was muted. On April 29, 1986, Granma reprinted a 3-sentence long announcement from the Soviet Union State News Agency, essentially saying that an accident had taken place, but that everything was fine. And in the days following that, the Cuban newspapers essentially parroted Soviet media, which downplayed the incident. Cuba, of course, wanted to remain a steadfast Soviet ally and also didn't want to cause alarm about its own nuclear project. Most Cubans I talked to told me that they were not aware of the scale of the accident at the time. One Cuban I interviewed was studying in Kyiv when the accident happened, and Chernobyl is very close to Kyiv. He learned what had happened from his mother, who called him on the phone from Cuba to ask if he was okay. But Cubans began to learn the true scale of the accident later, around in 1990, when Soviet and later Ukrainian children began to arrive in droves to receive medical treatment in Cuba. The impetus for this program came from Anatoly Matvienko, the General Secretary of the Ukrainian Komsomol, who expressed his, quote, worry about the state of the Ukrainian children after the accident to Cuban consul Sergio Lopez in 1989. Now, Cuba was ready to answer this call. It had already had significant experience providing medical aid to Soviet people because it had treated a small number of veterans from the Soviet war in Afghanistan and victims of the large earthquake that happened in Armenia. So in March 1990, the first group of children from Kyiv arrived in Havana, and you can see a picture here of Castro greeting them at the airport. And the program continued well beyond the fall of the USSR in 1991, through the special period, and all the way up to 2011 when it was terminated. In total, over 26,000 people were treated, 22,000 of them were children, and 86% came from Ukraine. And after 1998, Cuban doctors also treated victims of Chernobyl in Ukraine, in Kyiv and Crimea, and I've met some people who received treatment. So this program became a really important part of the bilateral relationship between Ukraine and Cuba. And Ukrainian President Yanukovych gave the Cuban ambassador to Ukraine a medal as sort of to commemorate his contribution to the program. Castro returned the favor. He decorated Yanukovych with the Jose Marti Order. And I find this very interesting, but in particular, I find it interesting because as I learned that past summer, the Children of Chernobyl program was not Cuba's only experience with Soviet nuclear power. As some of you may know, since 1976, the Soviet Union had been providing Cuba with technical assistance for the construction of 2 nuclear reactors in Juragua, near the Cuban city of Cienfuegos. And you can't actually go to the reactor now, but I have visited the area, and it's really fascinating to see. I highly recommend next time you're in Cuba to take a visit. Work on the first reactor began in 1983, and it accelerated very quickly. Soon it was dubbed La Obra del Siglo, the project of the century. An entire city called La Ciudad Nuclear, the nuclear city, was built around this project, and it was supposed to house all of the engineers who were to work there. And you can actually visit the nuclear city. It's somewhat abandoned, but many people still live there. Now, Chernobyl damaged the credibility of nuclear energy worldwide, but not in Cuba. In the late 1980s, construction on the plant slowed. There were persistent delays. When the USSR collapsed in 91, financing dried up. And in 1992, Castro announced a, quote, temporary halt to the construction of the plant. And then in 2000, he and Putin decided to officially abandon it. But while the plant did close, this appears to be not a product of the anxiety within Cuba about the future of nuclear power after Chernobyl, but rather a product of the financial circumstances surrounding the fall of the USSR. Basically, there was no money. And so all of this research that I did was based on an analysis I did of newspaper articles that were published in Granma. I used an index that I found from the University of Texas to collect all of the articles that mentioned Chernobyl, the Children of Chernobyl program, and the Juragua plant between 1983, when work on the plant started, and 92, when work on the plant ended. And I found that coverage of the Children of Chernobyl project was extensive. Of the 25 articles published between 1990, when it started, and 1992, when I finished my analysis, 48% were on the front page of the newspaper, and 76% were above the fold. But although the accident itself, what led to the program, was in many cases omitted completely or reduced to a brief sentence. But I argue that by providing such high-profile coverage to the program, the Cuban government was implicitly acknowledging the scale of the tragedy. So at first glance, it may seem that Cuba's reaction to the Chernobyl accident was contradictory. At least that's what I thought when I started thinking about this. On the one hand, Chernobyl had a negligible impact on the construction of the Juragua nuclear power plant. On the other hand, by offering to provide free medical treatment to thousands of victims, the Cuban government was clearly signaling that it was aware of the scale of the accident. So I asked myself, if Cuba understood the human consequences of Chernobyl for the USSR, then why did it not proceed more cautiously with the Juragua project? Well, as you may imagine, and as you're probably guessing, I found that really there wasn't a contradiction so much, because both of these programs served important Cuban goals in terms of maintaining autonomy and increasing Cuban prestige. So what do I mean by that? Well, by autonomy, I mean that, as you are aware, I'm sure, traditional accounts of Soviet-Cuban relations portray Cuba as a client state. But of course, Cuba did not see itself this way. While Cuba was indeed subordinate to the USSR for most of the 70s and 80s, it never fully surrendered its autonomy. For example, it supported many liberation movements in Africa, most famously in Angola, of its own accord. In Juragua, Cuba was careful to highlight that its VVER light water reactors were different to the RBMK graphite model that was installed at Chernobyl. Cuba was convinced that its project was safe and that it would not repeat the mistakes of the USSR. It was not a Soviet puppet doomed to the same fate as its master. Likewise, the Children of Chernobyl program was a way for Cuba to put itself on equal footing with the USSR. From the 60s through the 80s, as we all know, Cuba was dependent on Soviet aid. But the Children of Chernobyl program was a way for Cuba to demonstrate that this relationship with the USSR was not one-sided. Additionally, both of these projects contributed significantly to Cuban prestige on a global scale. Juragua was central to Cuban development goals. Even before the revolution, Castro had dreamt of bringing electricity to the island, and nuclear power was a way to do this. It was also a badge of honor and a way to join the prestigious club of nuclear-powered nations. So nuclear energy would not only drive industrialization in Cuba, an important development goal, but also improve the island's standing on the world stage. And similarly, the Children of Chernobyl program was an opportunity for Cuba to showcase the crown jewel of its social policy, its healthcare system. And it was also a way to best the United States. After the ceremony marking the opening of the Tarara treatment facility, Castro ridiculed the fact that the, quote, great, immense, and rich country to the north, end quote, offered to take in only 300 children when Cuba was prepared to accept tens of thousands. And so I also want to draw your attention to an interesting contemporary connection, which is this whole question of medical internationalism. As we all know, the story of the Niños de Chernobyl program is part of a larger conversation about Cuban medical internationalism. And in some of the previous panels that I watched earlier this week, panelists alluded to the amazing work of Cuban doctors during the pandemic. But there's also debate about whether Cuba should really be directing its scant resources abroad when there are so many challenges, shortages, and necessities unmet at home. And these same questions came up time and again with regard to the Children of Chernobyl program, which, as I mentioned, continued throughout the special period when Cuba really was in dire economic straits. So this paper only scratches the surface of the relationship between Cuba, Ukraine, and nuclear power. As I mentioned, it was a term paper, but I really hope to continue this research, perhaps this upcoming year at Cambridge. In particular, I'd like to conduct research in Ukraine and interview Ukrainians who had been treated in Cuba, because I think this program is fascinating and it hasn't received a lot of attention. I also want to draw your attention to some further questions that I had, which may inform my research. For example, what role did the US play in Soviet-Cuban nuclear cooperation? As I mentioned at the beginning, the US was very opposed to this project of the Cuban nuclear power plant. How did Cuba's thinking about nuclear power change with the fall of the Soviet Union? As I mentioned, this program continued till 2011. And so what role does Chernobyl now play in contemporary Cuban-Ukrainian relations? And finally, how much is this uniquely a Cuban story? What parallels can we draw between the Cuban case and other countries' histories of nuclear power and disaster? I'm thinking, for example, about Japan, which has a very sordid history with nuclear energy, but also is a nuclear power and has touted nuclear energy as an important way to produce energy. So these are all interesting questions, and I look forward to your advice as well about further areas of investigation. So just briefly to wrap up, I'd like to sort of use this time to tell everyone to watch the Chernobyl series. It was fascinating, and it really spread like wildfire in Havana, being passed around on people's USB drives. But at the same time, Cuba has, for the past few years, been reliving its nuclear past on screen. In 2015, the movie La Obra del Siglo was released, which is about the abandoned Ciudad Nuclear. It's very interesting. You can find it on Amazon. And in 2018, another film was released, which you may have seen, Un Traductor, which chronicles the story of a University of Havana professor of Russian literature who translated for some of these visiting Ukrainian children. When I was in Havana last summer, this movie was playing in all of the theaters, and it's very interesting. But I just thought it was interesting to see how these two films highlight the strange connection between Cuba and Chernobyl. And I think that they show that it is still relevant today. And they show that although this is part of Cuban history, the programs, both of the programs, still have lessons for Soviet-Cuban relations, Cuban national self-perception, and also questions of developing countries' nuclear ambitions. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. Thank you. Before turning over to the discussants, I want to take a couple of minutes and share with the students and with the other members of the panel and with all the participants in this panel, which I'm very pleased to have. We have a significant number of participants in the panel. These are words for the students from Carmelo Mesa Lago. I don't think I need an introduction. I don't need a bio. I think everybody who knows Cuba in any capacity, in any field, in any discipline, is familiar with Carmelo's tremendous contributions to Cuban studies and to the study of the Cuban economy for many, many years. So I'm going to turn over to, since the words, these are comments from Carmelo for the students, and I know all of you are fluent in Spanish. Voy a pasar al castellano, si me lo permiten, y les voy a leer las palabras de Carmelo. For those of you in the audience who may not be fluent in Spanish, my apologies, but I will read his words verbatim in Spanish. Palabras de Carmelo Mesa Lago. O sea, para ustedes, los estudiantes, las que han expuesto sus trabajos aquí y también para los demás participantes en el concurso de ASCE. Ahí vamos. Por primera vez en este año he sido parte del comité de selección de los trabajos de estudiantes de posgrados presentados a la competencia por el premio de ASCE generosamente establecido por Jorge Pérez López, lo cual considero un gran honor. La lectura y el análisis de los trabajos ha consolidado mi esperanza de que la nueva generación de académicos que trabaja sobre la economía cubana son de altísima calidad, radican en diversos países y se dedican a importantes aspectos del tema, lo cual asegura el futuro del campo. Mi felicitación a todos los contendientes y ojalá que en el 2021, es decir, el 2021, hayan aún más trabajos. Estas son las palabras del distinguido profesor Carmelo Mesa Lago, un gran amigo y colega de todos nosotros, para ustedes. Así que felicidades. Now I'm going to switch to the idioma del imperio, the English, the lingua franca. We have two discussants, and I realized after looking at my own presentation that I should have asked the discussants for their bio. I know Professor Silvia Pedraza introduced Professor Enrique Pumar prior to that, and he will be our first discussant. He will be commenting on the papers by Denisse and Isabelle. And then following that, we're going to have Michael Strauss, who will be commenting on Adriana's paper. For the interest of time, I'm going to ask both of them to be very brief. And then following that, we will have the Q&A session. And then following that, we will have some closing remarks by myself, but also some closing remarks by our outgoing president of ASCE, Professor Silvia Pedraza. So without further ado, Professor Pumar, we look forward to hearing your comments. We have to unmute you. Hang on. Enrique, if you can unmute your phone, your microphone, please.
I thought I had done it, but can you hear me now? It looks like a cell phone commercial. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? So I'm not making a commercial for anybody. I just you know, found it convenient to use the phrase. Since this is the last panel of the conference, I'd like to express my gratitude to Sylvia for her leadership the last 2 years, to Larry and Frank for putting together the conference via Zoom. This is something that is unprecedented. First time that ASCE goes fully virtual, and perhaps may not be the last. They deserve a tremendous credit for their vision and their organization. And most of all, of course, my gratitude to Mario for handling the student, leading the student panel, and for the work well done, and also for giving me the pleasure to participate today and to offer some very humble comments to all of you. I echo what Sylvia said before, which is that at ASCE, we all look forward to this moment. We always look forward to the panel. And the 3 presenters today is another testament of why we do that. The students always present us with very fresh ideas, insightful comments, very well-organized papers, with very, very good data, which sometimes we cannot collect ourselves because of work responsibilities and so forth. And also with a lot of provocative questions to think about. So I want to thank the 3 presenters today. You know, just to say that this year, like other years, have been fantastic. And I would love for you guys to continue being a member of ASCE and to contribute to the organization. Mario is very humble, but Mario, I first met Mario when he was a student, and he presented at the student panel, and now he's a professor, and so many other people that we can mention. But Mario is a very good example of the kind of association that we would like to see with you, and the type of engagement that we all would like to maintain with all of you. So I hope you could take that seriously. As Mario said, let me go right into my comments. I am responsible for commenting on 2 papers, the paper by Denisse and the paper by Isabelle. First, let me start with the paper by Denisse. The paper by Denisse is a very good study of how the Cuban community, despite many, many problems in the community and despite many misperceptions, have chosen to engage in Cuba politically and economically, although quite frankly, she doesn't talk too much about politics. She concentrates on economics. I have an anecdote to share with you, which I think demonstrates the extent of this engagement. My wife and I, we were sending a care package last December, and we were in Hialeah, and the woman that was attending us gets a call, and she, you know, we're right next to her on her desk, and she speaks with somebody, and then she turns to the head of the agency and said, "This woman is asking if we can send arroz y frijoles negros for tomorrow to celebrate Nochebuena in Cuba." And my wife and I looked at each other and said, "Oh my God." And the head of the agency said, "No, there is no time to send arroz and frijoles negros, but there is time to send arroz frito." And we were, okay, wow, this is, if there is a sign of transnationalism, this is it. There is no other variable that explains this better than transnationalism. However, I would like to comment that the literature on transnationalism also is a two-way street. And I think that although the paper is very well written and highly provocative, I would like to encourage to Denisse to look at the way Cubans have influenced Cubans from the island have influenced the Cuban community in Miami. There are many ways to do this. If we look at sociological theory, George Simmel, in his very famous book, The Philosophy of Money, says that money is simply an attribute of symbolism and social relations. And if we use Simmel as a point of departure, we can see that the Cubans from the islands have influenced tremendously the community in Miami, both symbolically and in terms of social relations. One way to measure this is just to look at the fixation of Cubans in Miami with Cuba in the island. I am always amazed that during this time when our country, and by that I mean the United States, is undergoing one of the most decisive political elections, Cubans in Miami are still judging candidates based on their position on Cuba. If that is not an influence of Cuban in the island on Cuban in Miami, I don't know what it is. And with regard to social relations, I would encourage Denisse to ask Cubans in Miami, how much sacrifice do they have to put up to send remittances to Cuba? Money is not elastic. Money is zero sum, especially when you live with a fixed income like most people in Miami do. I know many people in Miami that do not send the kids to FIU, even though FIU is dirt cheap. They don't send the kids to FIU because they don't have money, because they send money to Cuba all the time. Instead, the kids go to Miami-Dade or another, or they simply wait for a free ride from the Florida state, to the amazement of those of us who pay taxes in the state. So I think it is very important that we look at the both ways relationship of transnationalism. Two other questions very quickly before I switch gears to Isabelle. It is always very important, in my opinion, to understand why transnationalism happens. I think that this is a it looks like a very easy question, but it's actually very complicated. Again, I love sociological theory, so I would say, in my opinion, one good head start to answer this question is to look at Durkheim dynamic density. I think that he offers some very insightful comments here as to why this happens. But it is very important to understand, why transnationalism happens, because that tells us something about the literature of transnationalism itself. I think that most people who study transnationalism are so preoccupied with documenting the degree of relations between two communities that they forget that transnationalism is often a condition of political and economic reasons beyond the communities that are engaged in transnational relations. A very good example is the recent decision by President Trump, or by Trump, not my president, by Trump, who denied all flights to Cuba. That seems to me that it's going to stop a little bit of the transnationalism. My friend Nikki, who has a girlfriend in Miami, is not going to be able to see, in Havana, is not going to be able to fly to see her. He's actually getting a refund on his tickets that he had scheduled to fly to Havana. So I would encourage Denisse to think a little bit about how transnationalism relates to the political and economic climate of the countries and how that influences transnationalism or the dynamics of transnationalism. Finally, before I jump to Isabelle, let me mention that it is very important too that when we look at transnational relations, we pay particular attention as to why this is happening. I mean, not just why transnationalism occurred, but why it manifests itself differently in different generations. Denisse alluded to that, and I agree that not everybody reacts to Cuba in the same way. By the way, this is not unique to Cubans. I've done some research in Central Americans in Washington, D.C., and the young Central Americans react very different from their parents in terms of remittances and contacts with family and so forth. So this is a very fascinating question. Great paper, a lot to think about, much more if you decide to look at some of my suggestions and some of these questions for further research. Now let me address Isabelle's paper. Isabelle's paper is fantastic. I love the archival research that you undertook. I commend you for the depth of your research. I, as a college professor, I cannot imagine someone like you doing research in 3 countries for a term paper. Imagine for your dissertation. This is going to be amazing. You know, but so there's a lot of very good things about the paper, but obviously in academia, you know, receiving comments is actually very good. I was once told that if you present a paper and no one gives you comment, it's because they didn't like the paper. So the fact that I'm going to comment on some research is because I like your paper very much. I think that you present a very good question, which is why Cuba provided medical assistance and didn't make a big deal about their own nuclear plant. And you talk about, you try to solve that paradox by saying, well, Cuba is not a client of the Soviet Union, or at least they don't see themselves as such. My reaction to that is that very few clients see themselves as clients. And I think that in order to understand the dynamic of clientele relations between Cuba and the Soviet Union, we need to go back to the 1960s. In the 1960s, 2 events happened that are very relevant to your research, Isabelle. The first is that at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Castro was really, really upset because when the Cubans, when the Soviets negotiated with the United States, they left him off the bargaining table. In fact, he was so upset that he became almost belligerent, and the relations between the Soviet Union and Cuba cooled off for a little bit. When they were about to warm up again, the Prague uprising occurred in 1968, and Castro went on Granma and applauded the uprising first. But then immediately, something unprecedented happened. The Soviet Union put an embargo on Cuba. Those of us who were living in Cuba in 1968, we were embargoed by 3 countries, by the United States, by the Soviet Union because Castro didn't agree with them, the Brezhnev Doctrine, and by the Chinese because there was a dispute about that Cuba was not paying for some rice that had consumed for the Chinese. And Mao was very idealistic, but not when it came to money. When it came to money, you had to pay him. So this lasted for about a week, and then Castro gave back, took back his position and defended the Brezhnev Doctrine, reversed itself. And I think that this defined the clientele relation between the Soviet Union and the United States. And the client relation, as I see it, is as follows. One type of clientele relation is what I would call a hegemonic dependency, in which, as you pointed out in your paper, the master basically tells the client what to do. This was not the case as a result of the 1960s. The Soviet and the Cuban understood that Castro was too proud, and because of that, there has to be, the relation was complicated. There had to be a little bit of freedom for Castro to maneuver. So there is a less hegemonic clientele relationship that occurs here, in my personal opinion. And that clientele relation is one in which Fidel knows what the boundaries are. The boundaries are, you don't criticize the Soviet Union. And he demonstrated that in the non-aligned meetings, when he openly said that the Soviet Union was the natural ally of the third world. Imagine that. So I think that history is important, and it's important for how decision makers behave. Let me conclude, because I know my time is up, by saying that I have obviously many questions and suggestions for the paper. One is I would look at the sociological literature on clientele relationship to understand these relationships, since it is such an important part of your paper. I would also encourage you to situate your research in the international relation literature or theory. This brings my last point, which is that in international relations, there are at least two levels of analysis. You have the realist position, which assumes that the nation state has consistent principles and norms and interests. And you have the decision-making approach, in which it says that the interests of the nation state are defined by the leaders who make decisions. So this brings me to my last question. What can we learn from your paper for Diaz-Canel? Is the lessons for your paper a decision-making, are you assuming a decision-making approach where you basically telling us how Castro behaved, and Castro followed a very predictable pattern when it came to crisis, which you demonstrate in your paper, by the way? Or is this more the realist position that part of the Cuban creed is to react in certain ways to crisis? And if that is the case, what would the current leadership, no Castro leadership, would do? I think this is absolutely very important to understand the current situation in Cuba. Thank you both. Thank you for the opportunity to offer some comments.
Thank you, Enrique. Now we're going to move on to Michael Strauss, who will share his comments about Adriana's paper. Michael, please go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, thank you, Mario, and thank you, Adriana. I also want to thank Isabelle and Denisse, because I found all three papers really quite interesting. One of the places I teach is at the Belarusian State University, and they have a new nuclear plant that's going to go into service next year. I had a chance to visit that, and the message was, don't worry about a thing. They also said no smoking and don't push any buttons. In any case, thank you very much, all three of you, for such excellent and interesting papers. And interesting really is the word that I want to emphasize. Adriana's paper I found to have very good organization, methodology, writing. It was a very clear exposition of the subject, and the subject itself is interesting and vital for all sorts of different socioeconomic reasons. And it's one of these papers that was a joy to read. You know, you get every now and then a paper there where you read it and you read it again and you think, wow, this is how it should be done. It doesn't get better than this. And I wish some of my students, be tempted to show it to some of my students, even though they study other things. In any case, rather than dwell on comments, because I just more or less summarized them, and because time is limited, I wanted to do something that papers that I really like inspire me to do, and that is something you mentioned as well, Adriana, which is, where do you go from here? What other subjects of inquiry does this research lead to? Can it lead to? I find that some of the best research provokes new questions. So I wanted to share some of these questions with you. And if there's time to answer any of them, if you have a sense of them, but if not, it may be roots for future research projects. One question I had was, okay, the remittances increase the resources available for people in Cuba to engage in political protests. I don't know what how the resources are used, whether it's direct or indirect, whether that's even measurable, but does this become to a certain extent, discretionary income if it's not used for necessities? And to what extent does this, improve their lives in other ways besides allowing them to engage in greater political activity? Are the people who receive the remittances cognizant of the relationship in a more general sense between the fact that, okay, they have some money, we can now get more involved in political protest or some other political activity? Are they cognizant of it at the personal level with their own remittances, but also in a more general sense, and what the potential might be? Also, to what extent is the Cuban government cognizant of this relationship? Because that can play into policies they enact, both with regard to it can play into policies both with regard to what the Cuban government does and what the United States government does. Limiting remittances to Cuba, for example, which the US has done, is that a policy that takes into account the kinds of research that you do? So these are very, very interesting questions to me. I don't know what the answers are. It may be that you will in a couple of years if you pursue this path. And the other question that this raised was the general question is, to what extent might the remittances be made with the purpose of indirectly or encouraging protest if the remitters themselves are also aware of this? And that awareness is something that I have no idea of. My guess is that most of them don't think about it, but I don't know. I haven't seen any research that discusses that. Another area, another range of questions comes about because there have been a lot of studies that show that socioeconomic status there is a correlation between socioeconomic status and the engagement of individuals in political activity. Almost like it's a kind of, I'm oversimplifying, but it's kind of a luxury activity. The better off you are, the more you can do, and the more time you have to do it. I think, it was William Erb if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who wrote 50 or 60 years ago. I'll just read the sentence because it really sums it up. Whether the he said, the higher the social status, the more likely to register, to vote, to be interested in politics, to discuss politics, to belong to politically relevant organizations, and to attempt to influence the political views of others. And that's pretty much held true in other studies on this subject. Now, it raises the interesting question about the remitters, because they are, in a way, voluntarily reducing their economic well-being for themselves in order to provide money to family or whatever in Cuba. What does this do to their engagement in politics? Does this have a diminishing impact, for example, on the political activity of Cuban Americans in any kind of way that might be measured? So these are, some of the questions that arise. Do they, not consciously perhaps, reduce their socio-political engagement in the United States? And might they have, along with their remittances, some sort of socio-political engagement themselves in Cuba with the funds that they remit? So these are all, to me, interesting questions. All of them are things that came out of reading your paper, which is what I like about doing this kind of exercise. I hope that you are able and interested enough to pursue some of these. If you have any ideas of what some of the answers might be, if there's any time left this evening, I'd love to know. But anyway, I'll leave my comments there because we are limited in time.
Right.
Thank you again.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Michael. So what I like to do now is go on to the Q&A session, read a couple of questions. There was a question from Roger Betancourt, and the question pertains to the, it looks like it's directed to Adriana's paper or Adriana's presentation. So his question, I'm going to paraphrase it, is the role of government. So I guess is what is the role of government repressive actions in affecting protests? So that question, I'm going to also look at or consolidate some other questions that are here from the Q&A. So let's do a block of 3 questions, maybe another block, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sylvia, who will close with her closing remarks. And there are a couple of questions from John Suarez, and I think the main question here is was the expansion of, he's talking about the expansion of the military's control over the Cuban economy and under the detente during the Obama era, the normalización de las relaciones and all that. So he's contextualizing this question in terms of, did really the detente achieve what we believed that it would achieve, because the Cuban military gained their, expanded their control on the Cuban economy? We can see that actually in recent months with re-dollarization. And then I'm going to, I was going to type my own question, but I have a very quick question and a comment, and then I'll allow you guys to respond. So Denisse, I think you presented a slide with Malmierka and the law, Foreign Investment Law 118, and it was paraphrasing something to the effect that there are no limitations on investments by Cubans residing abroad. But my question is, recently the Cuban government, MINREX, has announced that even Cubans who are in the island, los cuentapropistas, who want to export and import, now they'll be allowed to export and import, but those activities have to be done through a state-run intermediary. And we know how effective, or I'm saying that sarcastically, these state-run intermediaries have been over the last 60 years. So you mentioned in one of your policy recommendations to allow greater participation by the Cuban diaspora, but it seems to me that it's moving the other way when the government persists that the state must control the export and import business. My other very quick comment for Isabelle was about Angola. It's very personal because I lost family in Angola. And Cuba, I disagree. Cuba did not participate on its own accord in Angola. Cuba was fighting a colonial war, and it lost something like 10,000 Cubans in Angola. And the Soviet Union supplied Cuba with equipment, military advice, training, strategic advice, new weapons, and all that. And so my comment is just that I know it's presented everywhere that Cuba was, representing the third world. This was a liberation struggle, but it wasn't. It was Cuba participating as a client state for the Soviet Union, sacrificing blood for treasure. So that was just my comment. And let me just take a quick look at the Q&As. I hope I didn't miss anything else, but yeah, those are the only questions. So if please feel free to go ahead and respond.
Thanks, Mario. I can start.
Yeah.
I think just to make sure I got the question down right, it was around the role of the government in repressing protest.
Yes.
Great, thanks. So I think that this is really interesting and definitely complicated some of the relationships I was trying to look at, because in Cuba, protests are banned in such a way that often some of the activity is much more subtle than it would be in other countries, right? And so I think that, without necessarily like having signs or picketing, that there are still protest activities happening, and that just introduces another element of how do we measure protest and how do we capture some of these activities. And I think that one area that's really interesting is actually the private sector. That's where we are seeing some, different variants of protest happening. And I think that it's a great point to raise and something that should be, perhaps incorporated in when we think about protest, what it really means and different ways to measure that. Thanks.
Thanks.
Should I go? Okay, perfect. Thanks so much for the questions and also for the comments. I really appreciate Carmelo Mesalago comments to our papers. That's a great encouragement. For the question about the military control, I'm not sure if there has been an expansion of the military control. I think Cuba has been a centralized state and military has been over there since the time of the revolution. So I'm not pretty sure about the expansion. I'm sure they have been there. And for this new opportunity for private entrepreneurs to import and export, this is something that still to be seen. There is a meeting that is going to happen in October, and I'm very looking forward to what specifications and they will say about that. And my recommendation, of course, is like to integrate more both the private entrepreneurs with their own power and their own active participation, but also the Cuban diaspora to that process. So far, it doesn't look to me that it's going to that way, especially for the Cuban diaspora. They have been invited to participate in the process of economic change on the island, but only through the company of the state, not by their own or only with the private entrepreneurs. So, but that's my recommendation. And I will also want to thank Pumar for the comments and also to share some ideas here. I agree with Professor Pumar that it's important to see the transnationalism to the other way. So how things that happen in Cuba, the policies in Cuba influence how the Cuban diaspora react or what's their position, but also what's happened here. Like Pumar has said that Cubans in Miami are evaluating the candidates based on their position towards Cuba. And I see that's totally evident right now with the limitation of travels to Cuba. That policy seems to me really cosmetic and focused on the, to gain votes from Florida, especially right now that Cuba has crossed, like the borders have been closed again due to the COVID situation. So if you limited the trips again to Cuba, I don't think that is going to affect that much because there is not a lot of people traveling to Cuba now. It should be a right? But I think it's more cosmetic and more like to gain some votes among the Cuban American population in South Florida.
Great, thank you. All right, so I turn it over to our current president, outgoing president, Sylvia Pedraza, Professor Sylvia Pedraza, who will make the closing remarks. My many thanks for all of you for participating, to the audience for remaining with us. I know we're over time, we're kind of in a bind here for time, and it is a pleasure to have all of you in the panel. Without further ado, Sylvia, please, your closing remarks.
Thank you very much. I just don't want to leave without thanking all the people who worked with me the last 2 years. They were 2 years filled with crises of different sort, but crises. And very often I felt like, I think that people express it in Cuba when you ask them, how are you doing? And they say, estoy asfixiado, I am without, unable to breathe. And then they say, so how are you dealing with the situation? Oh, I am resolviendo, I am inventando. And I think in ASCE, we had to spend the last 2 years feeling asfixiados and then resolviendo and inventando. But I think that we did it. And I think that this, virtual conference is a very good expression of the fact that we came out, as I think one often has to come out, ahead of where we had been in the past. So I just want to thank everybody. I want to thank especially the conference panelists, and I will only say first names because by now we all know each other. But when I look at the cast of characters in this conference, it's actually amazing because you would expect, of course, a number of Cuban Americans. This is a Cuban American Association, and it was founded by Cuban Americans. But there's also a number of people who were Cubans in the island. There was a Cubano Español, there was a Cubano Colombiano, there was a Cubano Puerto Riqueño, and there was a Russian with an American heart, and Americans with a Cuban heart, and a Russian with a Cuban heart. So it's an amazing bringing together of people who have collaborated very well in this video teleconference that has allowed us to bridge over very wide separations in geography and do something together. I do, however, hope that the next conference will be presencial, face-to-face, because it would be awfully nice, as one usually does in a conference, if you can go out to lunch with some of your friends, if you can click a drink at the cocktail, if you can have a little bit more of a presence, un abrazo, un cariño. So we have done what we could with a video teleconference and have risen to the occasion. But I do hope that we get to see each other again at a face-to-face conference, and that hopefully that conference will be at FIU January 4th through 6th, 2021. Stay tuned through our website, ascecuba.org. And I want to especially thank the people who made the virtual conference, the technical aspects of it in particular, possible. And without doubt, that is first and foremost Larry Cata Baker, Fran Carlos Martinez, Mike Periu, our website master, and Jorge Perez Lopez. And the people who worked with me the last couple of years, our treasurer has been incredibly important. I mean, she keeps us solvent and she keeps us afloat, Silvia Villalon Nielsen. And my board was a very good board, okay? Within the board, we had subcommittees, and in particular, the finance subcommittee worked very well together and will continue, I think, to work together with me and with Gary together. And that involved Jose Ramon de la Torre, Luis, our treasurer, Silvia Villalon Nielsen, and myself. The board at large, in addition, also included Mario González-Corzo, Manolo Villalon, Michael Strauss, Roger de la Torre, Carlos Seigle, Cici Rodriguez, All of these people were very important in the difficult process of decision-making that we had to engage in over the course of 2 years. In addition, ASCE has survived and thrived for 30 years. This is its 30th year because it has a lot of people who volunteer, who take on different roles within the association and do them very well. One of those is Roger Betancourt, who handled our elections at a time when we couldn't put mail ballots in the mail because of the COVID. And we didn't know what we were going to do with the elections, but we did it. Joaquin Pujol, who does our ASCE news clippings, a number of people who work in the hosting committee, such as Maria Werlau, Ted Henken, Jorge Dominguez, Carmelo Mesalago. We have a lot of people who have worked in a number of different ways to keep ASCE moving forward as a volunteer organization with few resources, but a lot of heart and a lot of effort. And last but not least, we also had some very good institutions that helped us and supported us. For example, at FIU, at Florida International University, we're still hoping to have our next conference there. We should have had this August conference there. The Cuban Research Institute with Jorge Duani and his administrative assistant, Amy Correa. Amy has been incredibly good at sending messages around to everybody. And that was one reason that we got so many more students this year who, were able to submit their papers because of the wonderful job that she does announcing this. Dean John Stack has been incredibly supportive of our ASCE efforts, Aixa Citron, of the management of what we hope will still be the physical conference. And then Casa Cuba with Maria Carla Chicoen and her administrative assistant, Maite Morales. Casa Cuba also reached out to help us to announce it broadly, and we have their support without a shade of doubt. At Harvard, Cuban Studies also stepped forward to help us announcing the conference, and so that was the work of Alejandro de la Fuente and Jimena Codina. And so we've had a lot of people really who, helped us at a different moments to make this virtual conference and the work of ASCE more generally possible. We hope to see you in January 2021 at FIU. And if we don't see you at a physical conference, we will probably see you at the second virtual conference of ASCE in next January. But thank you very much. Thank you to the students for their papers. They were all three wonderful. You are the future of Cuban studies. So I'm very pleased to see your papers, and thank you to everyone. And now Larry Kata Baker is going to introduce our next president, who is Gary Maybarduk, who will certainly have all of my support and help. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And we really appreciate the last 2 years of work. But you all are not here to hear me. You all are here to hear Sylvia first. And now it gives me extraordinarily great pleasure to introduce the incoming president, Gary Maybarduk, who's a PhD economist, retired Foreign Service officer, and a member of our board. He's been writing on the Cuban economy since 1999 when he was counselor for economic and political affairs in the U.S. interest section in Havana. His work in Cuba has been extraordinary. The amount of insights that he has been able both to gather at the time and then to cultivate over the course of the last several years is just extraordinary. He brings great insight to the organization and to its directions. And without further ado, Gary, welcome and congratulations.
Thank you very much, Larry. I had a whole bunch of thank yous to give, but I think Sylvia's pretty much covered them all. But I still would like to make a few thank yous, especially to Sylvia, who has guided ASCE through 2 challenging years. Public and academic interest in Cuba has waned in recent years, and ASCE's membership has suffered as well. Sylvia has led the board in finding ways to cut our expenses and been very energetic and successful in encouraging donations from our members. With declining membership and rising prices from the Hilton Hotel, Sylvia has forged an alliance between ASCE and the Cuban Research Institute at the Florida International University, where we will hold our next in-person conference, be it in January or most likely next August. That was not an easy decision either for herself, but she pushed it through. And I believe it will become a part of ASCE's long-term future. Oh dear. My internet's become unstable. I may end up having to change platforms, so we'll bear through it. This conference would not have been possible without the help of Larry Baca, Jorge Perez Lopez, and Frank Martinez. Along with the other members of the virtual committee, Larry provided the inspiration for the virtual setting. Jorge, along with Larry and many of the board members, put together the agenda and selected the participants. Those choices were difficult. The selection committee was narrowed and broadened by internet availability. We tried to choose panels with the most widespread appeal. And although I know that many of our members would have done just as well, these year's panels did an excellent job. Even after working in Cuba for 23 years, I was amazed at what I learned these past 3 days. So thank you to you all. Frank Martinez guided us through the Zoom process, including the practice sessions. We had very smart and wise panelists, but quite a few of us are old codgers who needed support for the newfangled social networking. Frank gave it to us and did it with many long hours. The panelists themselves also worked hard, and not just on their papers. I think they enjoyed the camaraderie of the practice sessions and the new skills they've learned. Behind the scenes was Mike Peru, our webmaster. Mike is leaving for new pastures and is going to be difficult and expensive to replace. Thank you, Mike, for all your service. Looking ahead, we are facing a lot of challenges. We will first require a decision as to whether to hold a virtual or in-person meeting in early January. The board, given the COVID in-person conference. That, however, is the decision of the board, who will discuss it at our September meeting. Please watch for an announcement. Regardless of that decision, I believe there is general agreement that times have changed and ASCE can reach more people if we hold more webinars or Zoom forums. Several interviews, Just a second. There we go. I don't know what happened. More webinars or Zoom forums. Several interviews with prominent ASCE members are in the planning stage. And an interview with Carmen Reinhardt, the economist, Harvard economist and chief World Bank economist, who wrote about the US financial crisis after the Great Recession, will also be interviewed. That will take place in August, probably around the 26th. So again, pay attention. Keep track, it'll be on our website. Reinhardt will discuss her views on the possibility of a long recovery after the COVID pandemic. This will be Reinhardt's second visit to ASCE and demonstrates the serious respect ASCE has gained among prominent economists. With the continued deterioration of the Cuban economy and a possibility of a new administration next year, I hope we will have several webinar events to stimulate serious discussion. I would also like to introduce a series of informal economic roundtables on events in Cuba with varying members and other Cuban observers. Whether called This Month in Havana or Havana Monthly, I hope this will bring greater community participation by all ASCE members. When I was first nominated for this job, I was seriously contemplating trying to start a speaker program, advertising it on our website, and hoping that making our members available to events around the US. We may still do that. It may be Zoom for a while, but we'll be discussing that in the board. All of these activities will require greater participation from ASCE members. That's you. The board cannot and should not do it all. I will be asking for volunteers as the year goes on, but do not wait if you want to help. Just let us know of your interest. I guarantee you we'll grab it. The agenda will force us to look for greater funding. In the past, our annual meeting has been self-financed. We do not want to put our virtual activities under a paywall, but they will increase our operating expenses. We badly need to upgrade our website. We need further help in the technical side of our virtual events. I would like to do some carefully targeted advertising, as we currently do in the Havana Times, to attract more members and viewers. This will not be cheap. So if you have not yet paid your 2020 membership or are new to ASCE, please open your checkbooks and join up. I promise you it will pay off for everyone, including yourself. One more item. If you're interested in preparing a paper for the January meeting, the new deadline is September 30th. Information on how to submit papers is on our website. We're going to see a new and updated ASCE in the next 2 years. I'm looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you. So thank you for coming. And I don't know if there are any questions, and if they're not, I'm not going to encourage them because yeah, they're not. Okay. So anyway, thank you. And I guess, Larry, this ends our session.
This ends our session. This ends our conference. And again, thank you to all the participants. Thank you especially to this last and just brilliant panel of student presentations, which I am just delighted to have been a part of, along with the other panels. For those of you who are ASCE members, the videos of the panels will be available at some point soon. So if you want to see the videos, please consider joining ASCE. And hopefully at a much later date, they may be more freely distributed. And again, thank you all. And with that, the conference has come to an end, and we will see you for the next one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye, thank you.